One of the things that I did during COVID was clean out my office a bunch. Once I got back into it, it was really sort of funny. My office sort of turned into this weird time capsule because I was out of it. I wasn't here for a good long time. So when I came back in August, everything was still on the desk from March, and it was like an archaeological. I'm like, oh, this is what I was thinking about 4 months ago that I wasn't thinking about anymore. But one of the things that I did is I cleaned out my office, and I finally decided to get rid of a good number of the books that I was holding on to because I thought they made me look smart. And I realized I was never going to read these books, and I was never going to use these books, and they were taking up space. So I got most of them out of there and inflicted them on poor Jan to see if she wanted any from our library here. And I think like 4 of them ended up in the library here, and I don't know where the rest of them went. I'm sure they're off in book heaven, wherever that is. It's always good to have a librarian around, FYI, for a lot of reasons. Anyway, so one of the things that replaced them on my bookcases were several Lego sets that I had, including this one. Some of you might recognize this. This is the Falling Water House from Frank Lloyd Wright. And one of the things that's kind of on a bucket list for me is I'd love to eventually go see the actual house. But what ended up happening was several years ago, Lego decided that they wanted to come out with some more kind of like adult versions of it because they knew we adults were playing with them anyway, because we were. And they're like, well, let's make some for them. So they came up with their architecture series. And in their first run of the architecture series, kind of the big one to get that had the most pieces and the most complex was the Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. It's actually really kind of hard to find now, but it was a lot of fun to put together. I think I don't remember. Gavin helped me or Vivian helped me. One of the two of you. Gavin helped me. He's waving his hand. We put this together. And of course, if you are going to do a series of Lego based on architecture, you basically have to include Frank Lloyd Wright. I mean, you just can't not, because he is such an important figure, especially in American architecture. Now, the first Frank Lloyd Wright building I ever saw was actually this one. This is the Lockridge Medical Clinic. It's the next slide. In Whitefish, Montana. It's actually the only actual Frank Lloyd Wright building in Montana, or at least it was before they tore it down in 2018, unfortunately. It was actually designed in 1958 as a doctor's office. And what ended up happening was the local doctor had gone to a local architect to ask them to design this 5,000 square foot clinic space for them. And they quoted them this really kind of what he thought was crazy high price. And he thought to himself, well, for that money, I should just get Frank Lloyd Wright to do it. And so he did. It's actually one of the last buildings. Frank Lloyd Wright died in 1959, so this is one of the last buildings that he designed. He didn't actually get to see it built. And I remember driving past it before I even knew what it was, thinking, that's a very interestingly designed building, and it was. So Frank Lloyd Wright is one of those people that people have heard of. They do documentaries about him. People still talk about him. If you're an architecture person, there was a time when I thought, especially in high school, there was a time when I thought I wanted to be an architect, mostly because the dad on the Brady Bunch was the architect, and then I decided not to. But Frank Lloyd Wright is also one of those people, though, that if you talk to him about other people who know him, there will come a time in the conversation about him where the other person will say, yeah, but did you know? Because as amazing as he was, and as how important as he was, and how much he really defined a particular style of architecture in the United States, he was not a perfect person by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, while he was a great architect, he also would be the first one to tell you he was a great architect. Yeah, humility was not something he suffered from by any means. And he actually had a pretty traumatic and, at the time, fairly scandalous personal life. He got married, and then he pretty much actually ended up abandoning his wife and his children for somebody else, and only to have that person actually tragically murdered. He wasn't involved in that, but it was tragic. And by the time he got to the end of his life, he'd actually been married 3 or 4 times, and was estranged from a lot of his children, and really struggled in that part of his life. And people at the time also kind of, did find him to be arrogant, and towards the end of his life, he really wasn't very well thought of. And there was probably about a 20-year time in the United States where, after his death, that Franklin Wright really actually wasn't talked about all that much, and then had to be rediscovered later. And most of the reason he wasn't really thought about much was because of some of the challenging aspects of who he was. Oftentimes, when we talk about important people and we talk about famous people, we want to build them up in our heads as somehow these people who are somehow better than us. And while certainly Franklin Wright was probably a better architect than I could have ever been, that is certainly true, that doesn't mean that he was a better person than I was. The truth is, if you dig into anybody's life, mine or anybody famous or anybody else, you're probably going to run into a yeah, but moment, right? Where, yeah, he's a good guy, but did you know, right? It's true of Frank Lloyd Wright. It's what some people call the Tom Brady problem. There's a sports one for you, Alan. Yeah, he's a great player, but. And the truth is, it's true for us as well. Yes, we have a lot of really good things going on in our lives, but none of us who are sitting in this room are perfect. So what then do we do with that? Do we not celebrate Frank Lloyd Wright and his amazing achievement and the work that he did just because he happened to be arrogant and have a bad marital and personal life? Do we ignore it completely? What do we do? So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. And we're going to talk about it with this character that we find in the Old Testament called Naaman. Now, some of you will remember that a couple of years ago, we did a sermon series on people you've never heard of in the Bible, and the lead-off person was Naaman. That sermon was aptly titled, Nay Who? We thought we were being clever. Anywho, but when I was thinking about this Sunday, there's a couple different characters in the Bible that kind of stand out as examples of what it is that we're talking about. That examples of where unexpected people do unexpected things, or imperfect people are asked to do important things. Obviously, King David is a great choice for that, but we've done a lot of King David, so I wanted to do somebody else. And so I was remembering the story of Naaman, but I also remembered there was another character that we really didn't get to talk about in the story last time terribly much. And the other person in the story that's actually in many ways as important, if not more important, is the young Jewish servant who is the one that sends Naaman on this little quest in the first place. Now, it's actually hard. You will not find very many, or any really at all, artistic depictions of this girl. She is not named, and when somebody is not named in the Bible, that's a hint that the author didn't think they were actually all that important, or we're not supposed to think of them as all that important. People with names are part of the reason people get names in the Bible or named dropped in the Bible is the same reason we name drop people today, right? Because we want them to be important, or we want to seem important for being able to name drop them. So the fact that she isn't given a name and isn't really given a background, other than that, she was one of the people who was probably carried off during the Babylonian exile. So it was at one of those times when the people of Judea, the Israelites, were conquered, and many people were carried off, and many people who were carried off were forced into servitude in various households. And so this was a young woman who was forced into service for Naaman's wife. So she is so she's not part of them. She is an other, right? She is not from there, and she is treated differently because she is not from there, and she is treated basically worse and of a lower status because she is not from there. Not only that, but basically she is. The Bible likes to use the words, she is a servant. Let's get real. She's a slave. And she is not in charge of her life. She's not in charge of who she works for. She basically has no power and no authority in this situation. And yet faced with all of that, when she meets her master's husband and realizes he is afflicted with this condition, leprosy. And leprosy in the Old Testament is actually a kind of it's a kind of catch-all word for any kind of skin disease. Right? If you had any kind of skin disease, then they would say it was leprosy because they didn't have lab tests and they didn't have any of that stuff and they didn't know how to tell the difference between this and that. But if you had any kind of skin disease, then they would say you had leprosy. We're not entirely certain what was wrong with him. But the big thing was most skin diseases were at best uncomfortable and at worst deadly, and most were contagious. So that was the most important thing to know. And of course, in a day without antibiotics and all the other things that we have today, the only thing you could really do with highly contagious people who had something that nobody else wanted to get was to hide them away, right? So the fact that Naaman got as far in society as he did, being afflicted the way that he is pretty uncommon, and he would know that. He would know that when people first meet him, the first thing they're going to think is, oh, here comes this great military leader. When people first meet Naaman, they're going to see, here comes this guy with leprosy. What on earth is he doing here? So the maid, with no power and no authority, recognizes what's going on, and without being asked, without being consulted, without anybody saying, hey, what do you think? She offers up a solution. She's like, well, there's actually this person that if you could go see, could help cure you. Now, this was at a time when servants don't talk to those who they serve without being asked. So the fact that she just pipes up and says, oh, if only you could go to this prophet that we know, you could be taken care of. The maid really shouldn't do this. And if you notice, too, she also disappears from the story after this. We're never actually told what happens to her or what her life is like, or what ends up happening down the road. Because really, honestly, after the story, we don't really ever hear of Naaman again until later. So we don't know what happens. What we do know is that Naaman, for some reason, chooses to listen to the maid. And chooses not only to listen to the maid, but to gather together to go to his king and get permission to go find this prophet, and takes with him a bunch of gold and a bunch of other things, a bunch of valuable resources, and goes and chooses to follow up and say, okay, I'm going to take a risk on what this person told me if it can help me. And went to talk to the king of Israel. Now, the king of Israel kind of freaks out because he thinks he's being set up. Right? He's like, he doesn't think what Naaman is asking for is possible, and what he's convinced himself is happening is that Naaman is there as an emissary from another kingdom to ask him to do something that's impossible as an excuse for that other kingdom to then come and invade Israel. Right? That's what he thinks he's being set up. Thankfully, if you continue reading the story, you realize that's not true. Elisha, one of the prophets, shows up on the scene, and Elijah is able to cure Naaman of his leprosy. And what all of this sort of sets in motion, well, it's interesting because there's a whole chapter dedicated to the story about this person that we never see again or hear about again, Naaman. Because at the end of the day, it actually really isn't even about him. What this is about is establishing Elisha, one of the cornerstone figures, in Israelite history, somebody who is a prophet that will be written about again and again, is somebody who really takes on a lot of power and importance, both in his life and after it. This is a story that helps establish Elijah and who he is. So this maid with no power, no authority, sets something in motion that then ends this place where the king is forced to recognize the power and the authority that God has given to Elisha. Something is set in motion that actually sets some other things in motion that allows Elijah to come to the prominence that God needs him to come to. And it all happened because a woman that nobody should listen to was listened to by a man who himself had his own kind of yeah but thing going on. Yeah, Naaman was a great general, but He's got leprosy. And I'm not sure we want to be around him. There are stories like this all over the Bible, over and over and over again, where God actually doesn't use people's strengths, but uses what we would consider their deficits to do good work in the world. That oftentimes God doesn't use perfect people because, as far as I know, there probably aren't any perfect people in this world, and I'm sorry to break it to you, there's no perfect people in the Bible. Well, there's probably one. You should probably know who that is. But outside that guy, there are no perfect people in the Bible either, and yet God continues to find ways to get work done and the work that God wants to get done. It can be too easy sometimes to focus on the yeah, but part of things. It can be too easy to not only be too easy to not only tear down other people in our brain, in our minds, but also sometimes too easy to tear down ourselves. And that's the problem with dwelling too much on the yeah, but. Is if we dwell too much on the things we don't have or the deficiencies we feel like we have, we can miss those places where God may be giving us the opportunity to do something important. The founder of the Methodist movement, John Wesley, was not immune to this either. And I know we've talked about this before, but it bears repeating. John Wesley, one of his first things he did in life was actually to come to the United States. Well, of course, we weren't the United States then. We were still a colony because this was 1735. And he came to Georgia, and he came to be kind of the pastor in residence of this brand new, amazingly designed, modern city of the future, Savannah, Georgia. We don't think about it in those terms, but in the 300 years ago, that's how they thought about it. And while he was here, he had hoped actually to come, and the reason he wanted to come is he really wanted to come, and preach and evangelize to the Native Americans. That's really what he wanted to do. Unfortunately, he was the only pastor in this area and never really got to do that because there were too many other colonists running around that he needed to minister to. And while he was here, he actually did something really interesting and actually fairly important, which is he published the first hymn book. He published the first hymn book ever published and printed on American soil. He printed a collection of hymns and psalms. And so the hymn book that we have today and all the other hymn books that we have today are descendants of John Wesley's original printed hymn book. So he did that. Yeah. But that's not what he's remembered for in his time here. You can't really talk about John Wesley's time here without also talking about Sophia Hawkins and Hopke. Sophia Hopke was a young lady about John Wesley's age that he met, who became part of his church. And there was an infatuation between them at a certain part. At this point in his life, John felt like if he was going to do the things that God called him to do and wanted him to do, he couldn't do that and be married. So he, on one hand, was interested and probably attracted to this young lady in the way that young men are, and at the same time felt conflicted about it, and so never really did anything about it. And after several months of this, I think with Sophia also saying she was interested and not being anything else happening there, Sophia eventually moved on and ended up marrying somebody else. And this did not sit well with John, and he struggled with it. And later on, using what is pretty much a technicality in the rules of the Church of England, they would come forward for communion, and John Wesley would deny her communion. Now we may go, that's interesting today. 300 years ago, that was a really big deal. Not only was it a really big deal, it was also a legal matter. And charges were filed, and John Wesley eventually ended up having to leave Georgia in the cover of night, escaping on a boat down the river. Otherwise, within the next couple of days, he was probably going to be arrested for what he did. And so he and his brother Charles, who had been there and didn't actually do very well, had his own problems and challenges, were basically forced out of America and forced back to England, where they would go on to start the Methodist movement as we know it today. I love myself some John Wesley. I have a whole collection of his letters. Every letter that he wrote that we still have, they bound into these 8 volumes. I have those in my office. I will occasionally take it off of my book, off my shelf as a bit of a devotional reading, and just read through whatever random thing John was writing about in that moment. I think he's a tremendous thinker. I think he's an amazing theologian. I think he set something in motion through his hard work with the Methodist movement that is still continuing to do stuff and bless stuff today. I believe that about John. But he was not a perfect person. He would go on to eventually marry, but it really wouldn't be a very loving marriage. And much like Frank Lloyd Wright, that part of his life would not be anything that any of us would aspire to. He did great things. He was not perfect. We have another sign. I'm glad Carrie Ann mentioned our first sign on the back wall. We have a sign on the back wall. We have another sign right next to it. Says this: at our church, we proclaim that God loves everybody just as they are, and God is challenging us all to become more. Because the truth is, we are all a little, but yeah. We all have a little yeah, but in us, right? If we look over our lives, we will see things we are proud of and go, yeah. And then we will see things that we are not proud of, and we'll go, but. But the truth is, and the truth that we know today, and the truth we know from the stories like Naaman and David and Wesley and everybody else, is that God uses all the other yeah-butters to do important things. That just because we are not perfect does not disqualify us from being God's children. Just because we are not perfect does not disqualify us from being God's work. Just because we have made mistakes in the past does not disqualify us from being part of God's good work to build the kingdom of God in the future or today. I think every once in a while we need to remind ourselves, and maybe even just embrace a little bit, the yeah, but in each and every one of us. To recognize that God already knows you're not perfect because God didn't expect you to be perfect because God didn't build you to be perfect. God built us to strive. God built us to be loved and to take that love and to become more than we are today. To recognize that we can't ever be loved more or less than we are in this moment, but that love that we have allows us to be more tomorrow than we are now. A little bit more like God, a little bit more like Jesus, a little bit more like who we are made to be, and a little bit more the people who do the work of building God's kingdom the way that God needs it to be built. We are all called to do that. The calling that's been placed on, we talked about this right from the beginning of the series, the calling that's been placed on my life or Kimberly's or anybody else's life or Carrie Ann's or whatever life isn't any different than the calling that's been placed in each and every one of your lives. We are all called in many ways to do the same thing, but do it differently. Because we're all called to love God, love neighbor, and love ourselves. We're all called to recognize that we are loved just as we are. And we're all called to strive to become more. And we're all called to look around the world and all of the things that seem to be wrong and to recognize that we can't do everything to fix them, but we can do something. So we are called, quite simply, to find our something. As I am, as you are, as we are blessed to be. And we are called to do this together. And we are called to bless, because that's what God needs us to do.